Good morning. Welcome. If you can grab a seat. I'm glad to see so many people coming today to hear a history talk. This is exciting, especially for all of my history nerds in the house. Woohoo! Welcome. I'm very happy to see you here. I am Dr. Gilhus. I teach in the history program here, and we're so excited to have Peter Mancall come and speak with us today. This is a partnership between the libraries and the history program to bring him in, so I'd like to thank Dean Mark Russa and Jeff Bowen. I know he said not to say his name, but he does a lot of work putting on this event, and I think we should all appreciate that work. So today we get to hear from a distinguished professor. This is Peter C. Mancall, and he comes as the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of Humanities at USC. He is a professor of history and anthropology. He is also the director of the USC Huntington Early Modern Studies Institute, and it says divisional for the humanities. I was confused by that part. He has other titles too, which I'll leave off. Let's say he's an impressive man. He has also published 7 books, which I'm only going to tell you 3 because I think they show some of the breadth and depth of what this man has researched. We have Nature and Culture in the Early Modern Atlantic. We have Deadly Medicine, Indians and Alcohol in Early America. And we have the Trials of Thomas Morton, an Anglican lawyer, his Puritan foes, and the battle for a New England. So there's a wide breadth of what he's studied. His specialties are colonial North America, early modern Atlantic world, environmental, and Native American history. So there is a lot that you could ask him about. We're excited to get to hear from him, and I want to turn it over to him now. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. I'm delighted. Thanks for Nicole for the.
Move this down for you. You have your.
Okay. All right. You guys can hear me? Okay. Yes. Excellent. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I live in West LA. Driving here this morning was really nice. I was telling Nicole the story that in a different world, I would be actually working here because this land was offered to USC a million years ago. But you are the beneficiaries, and I am the loser in that. But anyway, I'm delighted to be here. I'm thrilled to be in this amazing room and to talk to you today. I'm going to talk to you for maybe 35 to 40-ish minutes so that we can have a conversation about sort of how we wrestle with historical problems and writing history. And I come to you today with one book in mind. If all the stars line up, and who knows if that'll happen, in about a year, the book that I'm going to talk about with you today will be published. And sometimes it takes a long time to publish a book, to write a book, I should say. And this is a book. It's part of a series called The Oxford History of the United States. If you're a history major, you may know James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom is in this series and some other really big books. And these books are basically, they're long. They're really long. They're like 800 pages long. And they're narrative history. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk to you about today. And the book that I'm writing, which is going to be volume 1 of this series, I start around 1000, around the year 1000, and I end in 1680. I'm with the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, and it's a history of North America over those basically 700 years. You do not need to worry. I'm not going to read you the 870-page manuscript I turned in a couple weeks ago. In fact, my entire text for today is nothing more than my table of contents. What I want to do is talk to you about some issues and show you some pictures. So I think it's really important for historians to wrestle with the visual record. But first, I'm going to start with what I hope will be a useful way to think about things and some things that historians need to think about. And I sort of summarize this, distill this really into 3 things that I think all of us who write history need to think about, and we don't always think about. And the first is audience. You know, when you approach a historical topic, you know, you sort of think, well, I'm going to do research in this and I'm going to write this. And there's a certain logic there. But in fact, in point of fact, you have an audience in mind. If you're a student in an undergraduate class, your audience is your professor. If you're a junior scholar who is trying to transform the insights from her doctoral dissertation into a series of articles, the audience for that are the readers of a particular historical journal or a particular book. If you're then a little farther into your career, you might have a sense of you're going to turn your materials into a book. And even there are multiple audiences. Audience, I talk to people all the time, is something that we don't tend to think enough about. And we should think about it. We who are you who are trained historians or other people writing history should think about it, because there are a lot of people out in the world who write what they call history. And we who have some professional training in this do it differently than others. And so this question of audience is important. And for me, though I'm an academic historian, I teach over at USC, for me, I've learned a lot about these questions about audience by writing deliberately for very popular audiences. So a piece I had last year in Smithsonian, or pieces I've written for Time magazine. These are for the LA Times. This kind of writing demands a different kind of how we think about audience, because we don't want the world to think that historians only write for themselves. If we, as historians, don't tell our story to a wider audience, then people who lack our training will still be doing it. And in fact, I would say to you now, if you go into any airport and go to the history section, you will find a number of things in there that are written by people who do not have professional training as historians. We have lost that conversation. We have to get back. So audience is the first thing I would emphasize for anyone think about writing history. Second, actors. This might seem a curious thing to say, and I put it here in parentheses, form. What I have in mind here, and I'll talk about this as I'm going through today, what I have in mind here is, who are the people that we are writing about? The people don't have to be individuals. I write a lot about individuals. It can be other things. But we have to think about who are the characters who are going to drive our study forward. So whether you're writing a 7-page paper for an undergraduate class, or an undergraduate senior thesis of X pages, or a doctoral dissertation or a book, something is driving that forward. Now, there are a lot of ways to think about what that could be. It doesn't have to be human actors. But somewhere in there, there is a subject, and we have to wrestle with what that is. And third, and finally, you can go into an archive, and I walked through your beautiful library here. It's fantastic. And you can go and you can sit down and think, I'm the first person reading these manuscripts. I'm going to tell the world about this, and I'm going to describe what they say. True enough, but you are making an argument, because we all make arguments in what we write as historians, in what we choose to write about. We're already starting that argument. Why is this what I should focus my attention on instead of that, right? This idea of argument. Now, argument is tricky. It depends on, again, it goes back to this question of audience, and it goes back to questions of the actors. But argument is very important. So I'm going to take you through, in the next half hour or so, some of my process of thinking through how do I look at evidence and what argument do I want to make from the evidence. And then, in my case, writing a narrative history, which literally goes from point A to point B over a 7-century span, what stories matter. So I'll tell you right now, if I asked you to say, you think in your mind, what is a history that starts around the year 1000 and ends up 700 years later, what should be in it? There are a lot of things to go. And even though I have an enormously broad canvas, I could write 800, I just turned in 870 pages, which I don't recommend, by the way. I don't recommend them. I still make a lot of selections. There's still a lot of stories I want to tell that I don't have room for, but it depends on the stories we want to tell. And when I signed up to write this book some years ago, and I looked at the books in this very renowned series, I'm sure they're on your stacks here, what do? All of the other books in the series covered about 30 years, starting with the Revolution and moving forward. And the vast majority, the overwhelming majority of actors lived in Eastern North America, were involved in politics, and were typically famous. Well, guess what? When you go back to the 15th, the 16th, the 17th century, people are a lot less famous, and people are dispersed all over the place. And so my volume in the history of the United States has material about Mexico, the West Indies, Canada, Europe, the Pacific, Africa. It is on a broader kind of campus. I have to decide which stories I select, who I want to tell about, and what argument I'm making from those stories. Okay? This will make sense as I go through some pictures. And I've chosen to do this with pictures today because all of us interpret visual evidence. You guys, are in such a visually attuned generation more and more as we go forward. So you will have your own thoughts. Can we dim the lights a little? Is that possible? So this is an early map of the Americas, of the Western Hemisphere. Now, you don't have to be a geographer to say that that's not accurate, right? That is plainly an inaccurate representation of the physical world that we know. But this is the way that Europeans first began to think about the Americas, right? As this sort of place. And the map makers are putting it together. The map makers live in Europe, and they are putting it together based on information that sailors are telling them about what they saw, right? And so, imagine this. You're in the age of Columbus. You've crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Europeans had never heard of it before, and then they're trying to describe it. And this is a little later in the century when there's some sense that there are these continents. But some details aren't bad. I mean, you can see Florida sticking out there, right, in North America. I mean, they really did learn some things. Okay. One kind of visual evidence, maps. I may show you some others as we go along. In telling my story, starting in the year 1000 and going to 1680, people ask me, why 1000? Like, why start then? It's not obvious, except it became obvious to me that I needed to start with the northern movement of maize, of corn, from Mexico, where it was developed, into the Mississippi Valley, where it produced this civilization of the people we call Mississippians, because along the Mississippi River, at a place called Cahokia. Has anyone ever heard of or been to Cahokia? Okay, excellent. Excellent. Ooh, there'll be more quizzes coming later. Cahokia is a series of mounds in what may be the flattest part of the United States that you can ever possibly imagine, where the Mississippi and the Missouri River come together. And I say that this flatness is important, going back to some geography, because from the top of these mounds, you could see for miles and miles and miles. This is in a place called East St. Louis. It's not St. Louis, Missouri, it's in East St. Louis, Illinois. Maize plays a huge part of my story because the northern movement of maize, of corn, allowed for the flourishing of agriculture in what is now the United States, and agriculture led to population growth and to the reshaping of landscapes to produce more maize. So I have an agricultural revolution that takes place long before ever anyone's writing this down in the center of North America. My other plant is sugar. Sugar. Because this is the other agricultural revolution that matters. Starting around the time of the Crusades, when Europeans go to the Holy Land, go to the modern Middle East for religious reasons, they fall in love with sugar. And they start to develop sugar, and they develop a taste for sugar, and this is centuries ago. By the middle of the 15th century, 50 years before Columbus, Europeans wanting to produce sugar figured it would grow well in islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, but they faced the issue, who was going to produce it? And they settled on enslaved captive Africans. And this is the beginning of the slave trade in the middle of the 15th century. An agricultural revolution in North America led to the spread of maize. An agricultural revolution which led to the slave trade on the other side of the world. These two things are animating principles in the book that I've just written, right? Starting with these plants. Now, I could tell a story like this. I could tell a story like, what is the sort of scheme in which this world comes into existence? And here is one. I pulled this. You can find these things online all over the place. I could have shown you a picture of the so-called triangle trade, which you've probably heard of, about how commodities move through the Atlantic Basin. I could do that. This isn't interesting to me. It's not wrong, but it doesn't really help me tell a story. it sort of says, okay, this is going on, but how do I tell the story? Well, to tell the story, I need people. And the people who I need are the people who are crossing the Atlantic Ocean and meeting native peoples in the Americas. So this is just a picture. I'll come back to this picture later, but this is a picture from 1590. It's an imaginary picture. No one's seeing this take place. This is someone in Europe drawing, engraving this picture. Okay. We'll come back to those pictures because they're really important from this debris. But there are a lot of images that circulate from the 16th century. And part of the question is, what can we learn from this first series of encounters, these post-1492 encounters? Now, I imagine you're a fairly sophisticated audience. I imagine you're out there thinking, you know, this guy is not mentioning that there were these Vikings who went across the North Atlantic way before Columbus. Do you know about these guys? Yes, yes, yes. Of course you do. You're smart. College students at a great place. They're in my story a little bit. I'll happily answer questions about them. But the thing about those guys, these are people who sail in tiny little ships called Nor across the North Atlantic, from basically Norway to Iceland to Greenland, and then finally to Newfoundland and to Canada. They do this for a couple hundred years. They are the first European colonists in North America. But you know what they didn't do? They didn't really talk about what they did. They didn't tell their stories to other people. And so when the Atlantic got really cold in the so-called Little Ice Age that comes in around the 14th century, and ice started to choke all their routes, they stopped going, and Europeans didn't know what was going in North America. Fast forward 100 years to Columbus. When Columbus goes back, he's here, he comes to the Americas in 1492. By the spring of 1493, he has told Europe, this is what I found. Right? Now, we have long debates about Columbus. I have a long debate about Columbus in my book. I'm fighting with Columbus all the time. But one thing that is absolutely true about Columbus, whether you think of him as a hero, as many Americans did for a long time, or whether you think of him as a villain, as many Americans do now, as you may be aware, statues of Columbus have been decapitated and red paint tossed on them across the United States. Whatever you think of Columbus, you can't deny that what he did was important in spreading some idea about America to the Western Hemisphere. So not long after, these sailors go, and this atlas shows up now in Paris. It's called the Atlas Mill. You can see it. You can see it's rather schematic. They don't have a lot of information. But here's a picture of Brazil, right? This is from this beautiful hand-painted atlas. It's okay, well, this is interesting. But if you dig in a little deeper, this is 1515. You dig in just a little bit deeper, and you see this. What you're seeing are Europeans, as far as we know, already, we don't have the text, but basically enslaving or forcing indigenous Tupamaros into work to produce dye wood, to produce this wood, which would then be used to extract material and to make cloth in Europe. 1515. Europeans are already saying, we won't have a labor problem in the Americas because there are people there who we can control. No one is talking about what this means exactly, but they're depicting it. Now, if you know early American history generally, one thing that you know, a phrase that you probably know because you probably use in every textbook you had from elementary school onward is a phrase called the Columbian Exchange, right? You've heard this phrase? The Columbian Exchange is basically the exchange of biological stuff back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. And Europeans are the great beneficiaries of the Columbian Exchange because Europeans got tomatoes, and they got potatoes, and they got tobacco, and I'm sure that none of you are smokers. But in the 16th century, Europeans thought tobacco was a great medicine. So lots of people sort of obsessed with tobacco. So Europeans extract all these great things, but they also bring things to the Americas, including infectious diseases, which the peoples of the New World, as it came to be called very quickly, had no immunity to. This is presumptively a smallpox epidemic in Mexico. Right? So from the very beginning of the story that I'm telling you, from these early decades, I've already told you two of the dominant themes in my argument. Right? that the expansion of Europeans across the Atlantic Ocean led to enslavement, and the expansion of Europeans across the Atlantic Ocean led to infectious diseases. And those infectious diseases, over the course of 300 years, as far as we can tell, combined with warfare, reduced the native population of the Western Hemisphere by 90%. By 90% over about 300 years. Devastating, right? This starts early, and then it would continue. And we can talk about why it continues. It's not that Europeans were unsympathetic to what was going on. In fact, a lot of Europeans talk about this, try to make sense of it. But Europeans are interested in what they can get. Maize, this is from an Italian text from the mid-1550s. This, I will tell you, is not in your textbook. You don't think, oh, those Italians in the mid-1550s were interested in what's going on in the Western Hemisphere. But they are, in fact, and this text from a geographer named Ramusio shows maize and describes maize. I took out a picture. There's another picture that is in some of these things of pineapples, another plant that sort of fascinated Europeans. So Europeans keep saying to themselves, we can find these things, we want to go. What's going to happen when we get there? We're going to meet people. This is also from Ramusio. This is the same book, middle of the 1550s, and this is a visual description of what happened when a French explorer named Jacques Cartier went up the St. Lawrence in modern-day Canada. And he describes this place. And he describes this, what historians used to call village, but I call a city, which is actually in many ways more organized in this visual representation than most cities in Europe at the time. And I'm sorry I don't have a detail, but if you look at the very bottom of this, you can see two people shaking hands with each other. You see that? Right? Why put that detail in there? It's because in Cartier's narrative, which the artist read, but of course was not in Canada with him, Cartier talks about his relationships with these native peoples who we call St. Lawrence Iroquoians. And he's sending the message, we can get along with people, and if we can get along with people, it'll be easier for us to establish settlements, establish colonies there. Okay. Fair enough. Other information coming over suggests that maybe it wasn't always going to be so voluntary. And this is from Potosí, the place in South America, which has produced more silver than any other place in the world. And where relatively quickly, Spanish colonizers enslave native peoples to work in the mines. Okay? So again, Europeans want to extract material. How do they do it? Form positive relations on the one hand, brutalize people on the other. Anyone been to, some of you, you're such an international community, you've been to Rome, perhaps? If you've been to Rome, there's a fabulous church called Santa Maria Maggiore, the Basilica. It's really beautiful, and it's known for the gold leaf painting in it. That gold leaf was gold stolen by Spaniards, shipped to the Vatican, made into paint to paint the inside of Santa Maria Maggiore, right? At the highest levels of European society, there are people who are profiting on the natural resources to be found in the Western Hemisphere. Now, in the middle of the 16th century, as you may know, and I don't know how much you know about New Spain, in the middle of the 16th century, a big debate erupts in New Spain because the conquistadores had treated indigenous peoples with a lot of violence. But the Spanish also sent missionaries over. And some of those missionaries were very upset at what they were seeing. Because their view of the Western Hemisphere was, in their mind, here are all these people who don't have organized religion, or the organized religion they have is wrong, and they want to convert them to Christianity. And what the conquistadors are doing by torturing people is counterproductive. So one of them, a Dominican missionary, writes a text in the 1550s, which he calls a brief or short account of the destruction of the Indies, Bartolome de las Casas. A chilling book, a book of horrific descriptions of things that were happening to indigenous peoples. And Las Casas basically sends this to the king and says, We have to stop our people from doing this, or else we're never going to be able to get Christianity planted among these people. Right? We can't torture people and then expect them to embrace our faith. A very specific goal that he had. Okay. Well, I have a feeling at this audience, you'll know the next event I'm going to talk about. You've heard of the Protestant Reformation, yes? Safe, this audience, you know. Yeah, I go some places and not so sure, but I'm guessing that you guys have heard of the Protestant Reformation. What? Safe bet? Everyone's okay with, yes? You have some general sense of it? Okay. Well, whatever, I'm not getting into a theological debate up here, but whatever you think about the Reformation, it led to a series of religious wars within Europe, of Roman Catholics on the one hand and then various Protestants on the other. And, you know, very famously, when Henry VIII was unhappy with his first wife because she couldn't produce a male heir, he decides he wants to get a divorce and yada, yada, yada. England leaves the Roman faith and the Church of England comes into existence and as a very powerful Protestant nation. Okay? 1530s. Fast forward a little bit. The English, by the way, terrible at the colonization business. Don't embrace it like other Europeans do, but finally think, oh, this would be a good idea. Europeans think, okay, we're going to colonize North America. Sounds good. How do we convince people to do it? In this era of religious wars? Let's tell people like us, Protestants, how terrible Catholics are. And so Las Casas' book, which was entitled in Spanish, The Brief or Short Destruction, or the Destruction of the Indies, becomes in the English translation, The Spanish Colony. Las Casas had it as, these conquistadors are doing terrible things, we need to stop them. The English have this as, Catholics do terrible things. We need to stop them, right? So the same text now has a different power, different argument, just in the retitling of it, and then an introduction that the editor does in London, right? And then the English, reading this text, decide to go to one of the Protestant publishing houses, same one that publishes publishes another book I'm going to talk about Debray. And then they depict graphically what Spanish conquerors are doing to native peoples. These grotesque images of violence. They're not there. They're not being produced in the 1590s as this is going on now. They are there to convince Protestants, we better get to North America soon, or else these terrible people will destroy native peoples and, of course, come against us as well. Okay. Now I'm going to fast forward through a bunch of history here. Just a few things that you've heard of. I'm going to guess you've heard of the Spanish Armada. Yes? 1588, miraculous year if you're English, miraculous year. Not so much if you're not. And Queen Elizabeth afterwards has this picture taken, this painting done. Very famous. It's called the Armada portrait. Super famous. And if you can look, you can see her right hand is sitting on a globe, right? Because now she is going to rise up and she's going to be a world important figure in a way that she wasn't before the Armada. She looks, pretty friendly there. This same queen, in order to expand her realm, England, as we now call it, right? A Protestant country, before they go to North America, they went into Ireland. And in Ireland, they engage in a series of brutal actions in the 1560s and 1570s, which is really a religious conflict that predated and prefigured what would go on in eastern North America. Right? It's sometimes referred to as the Elizabethan conquest of Ireland. Right? There are English texts which brag about English commanders who, as one of them puts it, at the end of the day would go onto the field of battle, decapitate the soldiers they had killed, take their heads, line them up, he referred to it as a lane of heads, into his tent, so that people who would come to see him in the evening, the families, among others of the deceased, would be terrorized, would be used ad terrorem. Terrorism, we think of terrorism as a modern thing. It exists in the 16th century. It is the psychological part of warfare beyond casualties in war. Okay? So now I'm about halfway through my story, more than halfway through my story, getting you to think, okay, how is this all going to transplant itself and create North America? Over the course of the late 16th century, that same workshop, which is based in Frankfurt, does other images. One of the images it does is this. This is an image of a Tupinamba ritual using tobacco, where tobacco, so I know that you've never smoked, and I embrace and I'm thrilled that you've never smoked. But if you ever tried smoking, which you shouldn't do, don't run this experiment. If you ever did, it would produce a certain effect. The tobacco that these people are smoking was way more powerful, had these really powerful psychotropic effects. And so it could be reasonably thought that tobacco put people in touch with the gods. And there are a lot of native peoples who said, we use tobacco in order to communicate with the gods. And so there's this Tupinamba ritual captured in one of the texts from Brazil, which depicts exactly that. But the thing about tobacco, Europeans really like it. They like it, and they're fascinated by it. And they're fascinated by its medicinal properties as well as the fact that they think it's really great and cool and makes them feel happy. Another European goes into the West Indies. We don't even know the name of the person who did this. A little tiny book in the Morgan Library in New York describing tobacco. And in this book, it says, well, by the way, if you get shot with an arrow, I don't think this happens up in Malibu anymore. But if you were to get shot with an arrow, the way to heal that would be to lie on a hammock, another American invention that Europeans were fascinated by, lie on a hammock, and someone would burn tobacco underneath you, and the smoke would come up and heal the wound. It's a very vivid description of the utility of this particular plant. So Europeans are really into this and thinking, where can we produce this and what can it do? And so it's part of this growing body of information that they're picking up. And a bunch of this information ends up in a book written by a guy who goes to what is now Roanoke. You've heard of Roanoke on the outer banks of North Carolina, right? The lost colony. Right? This guy goes to Roanoke in 1585, a young guy named Thomas Harry, a mathematician, with two native Carolina Algonquins, Mateo and Wanchese, who he can talk to. They've learned how to speak with each other. He gathers all this information about this place. And this place, this story, is really important for the argument that I make in my book. Okay? Comes back with this text, publishes without pictures, and then a few years later goes to that DeBry workshop, and they produce this. And it starts off with this kind of imaginary scene of the English showing up. If you read this carefully, you can see ships going down. There's a sea monster barreling towards one of the ships. There's a lot you could read into one of these kind of scenes. The engravers in this case aren't just working from the text. They're working from a series of watercolors, which a guy named John White had painted in 1585. And not all the watercolors survive, but a bunch of them do survive. And so we can go back and forth. What did a European, an English-trained artist, see at the moment? This is 1585, Outer Banks of Carolina. And there's this man they call the Conjurer. He was a doctor. He seemed to have these religious abilities. And the painting is on the right. And the reason I'm showing you this side to side, the painting is done on the right by someone in the field as if this guy's sitting in a studio. When it then gets back to be engraved, the artists invent an entire scene around it, right? So this is a book that says basically this is the truth, and the visual pictures are invented, right? Based on what they read. And you can go on and on about these kinds of pictures. One about how prolific the seas are. One about the fact about this village, which they do a whole thing. And this village, this is Pumiok. It's an amazing thing happens. Oh, I think I can tell this story here. It's an amazing thing happens. The English bring them a Bible, and they say, this is the key. This is the key to everything. The knowledge in here, you will find out the truth. And native Carolina Algonquins open to this, take the Bible, and they rub it on their bodies. They're absorbing the knowledge, they think, in that tactical way not in the way that the English have in mind. The English would eventually sort this out. In the same book, there's this picture of a place called Sakota. Hugely important. I tell my own students that picture on the right, the engraved version, the most important picture that comes from North America in the 16th century. That picture on the right there. Because that picture on the right there depicts a successful community. And it depicts a successful community made by native peoples. And the logic of the book says, if native peoples can do this, the street is straight, the fields are all planted that way. I mean, a lot of things are made up here. If they can be so successful, imagine what we, Europeans, can do in this same place. We will try to convert them. They will then work for us, and we will have this productive economy. Well, who could believe such a thing? Who could believe that the English would succeed in this place? Oh, well, the creators of this book said, "You're a good point. How about these people?" Now, these people are terrifying. You know what these people are? Ancient Britons. And a series of illustrations attached to the same little book. They put these images of the people known as Picts, the people who the Romans described as dyeing themselves blue up along, Hadrian's Wall, way up there in northern Britain. Look at them, right? They're naked. They're tattooed head to feet. I'm not making a comment about tattooing. That's your business. They're tattooed head to feet. She's carrying spears. There's a head dripping blood. Terrifying. And you know what the text says? The text says the people of ancient Britain were as savage as those of Virginia, i.e., we, English, came out of them. Therefore, Carolina Algonquians will become English also. The visual picture tells the narrative. And the next sequence in this, a picture which you might have seen, is her, Pocahontas. Pocahontas becomes famous immediately when the English get to Virginia in 1607. Immediately becomes famous. Marries an Englishman named John Rolfe, a guy who plays a crucial role in the tobacco industry. Goes over to England, meets the king and queen, converts to become an Anglican, a Protestant, changes her name to Rebecca Rolfe, and is depicted this way in this very famous engraving. And that engraving, a lot of people have read this engraving, that engraving says something very important to me. That engraving says, those Europeans who were just looking at that earlier book about Carolina, with like the Conjurer and these others, guess what? We, the Europeans, our ways are so much better, that these native peoples, will convert immediately, and here's proof. She is the proof of the story that the English are telling themselves about how their form of colonization is better. The English, in this point, are not torturing people. This is their version. Okay? Now, a bunch of other Europeans come, and my story gets very complicated in the 17th century, and among them are these people, the Puritans and the Pilgrims, who we can have a long discussion about. And we may have a discussion about very sort of important. This is obviously a 19th century image of them, but they're known, among other things, for this thing called the Mayflower Compact, in which they all basically said, we're all going to get along, and we're going to have representative government, and yada, yada, yada. This is a complicated little document. But they're very famous. They're very famous in American lore. And for a long time in America, historians battled over who planted, not my word, their word, civilization in Eastern North America. The English would go to Virginia, or the English would go to New England. And they fought about this for decades. I don't think it was too violent to fight. The seal of the Massachusetts colony is this, where, and using a biblical phrase, this native man, this Massachusetts man, sometimes known as Wampanoag now, says, come over and help us. Right? So the English are saying, okay, we are being invited over here in our way of thinking about these kinds of things. Very important sort of thing. Come to help us. Our colonization will be peaceful. So they thought. Well, colonization is often a really violent business. And when the English were in Virginia in 1607 to 1609, they got there in 607. 609, they start to have a war with the Palatines. This war is a terrible war, will last for 5 years. Eventually ends when Pocahontas marries Rolfe, as I said. Get into the early 1620s, the Pilgrims, the Puritans have arrived in New Plymouth, what is now sort of modern Cape Cod, southeastern Massachusetts. and the colonial population is growing in Virginia, and they're all producing tobacco because there's so much demand for tobacco. March 22nd, 1622, an incident which we can talk about. A native leader named Opechancanough, Cano, upset at the growth of the English population, leads an uprising, and on a single day, they kill 347 colonists on one day, March 22nd, 1622. It's about a quarter of the white population of Virginia. The English immediately refer to this as a barbarous massacre. You can see that sort of subtitle, a relation of the barbarous massacre. Barbarous is important because they want to define the native peoples as other, as barbarians, as people who lack civilization. If you pick up this book now, there are physical copies of this book by a guy named Edward Waterhouse. Over 8 pages of the book, it lists every single person killed on March 22nd, 1622. This is nightmarish. And then eventually, the English would have this illustrated. The illustration comes after the illustration from 1627. If you read this picture carefully, you will see that it depicts Europeans as victims, innocent victims, having lunch when these, to their mind, barbarians descended upon them and massacred them. And this image makes the rounds. Okay? Now, the people in Virginia, this is happening. People in New England think, no, we're religious, we're the Pilgrims, we're Puritans, as sometimes called, we'll be different. Puritan population grows in the 1620s into the 1630s in New England. And then, well, if you saw the poster for this, you'll know that I have this picture. And this picture is about an event in something called the Pequot War, but we should all call it the Anglo-Pequot War, 1637. And in 1637, in the midst of this war, the English had Narragansett allies and Pequot enemies. Okay? And during this war, the English enlisted Narragansetts to eliminate the Pequots because they're convinced that the Pequots, they'd heard a rumor that the Pequots were going to ally with the Narragansetts and drive the English back into the sea. So to stop that, the English make this alliance with the Narragansetts, and then they attack the Pequots. This is one of the most horrific moments in early American history. And I'm going to read you a few sentences from a book that anyone who wants to read American history should know, a book called Of Plymouth Plantation, the standard history written by the governor of Plymouth, William Bradford, of this. Has anyone read this book before, parts of this book? Okay. It's long, but it's amazing, and it's amazing not in good ways. And if I have my glasses, I can actually read this. Sorry, I didn't think that part through. Well, interesting question. Sorry. I'll read it to you afterwards. It's like, because I'm such a professional, obviously I forgot to bring my reading glasses up on the stage. Anyway, Bradford describes this event. Wait. They surround this village. They set it on fire. And they shoot the people as they are running out. Bradford describes this. These people, these pilgrims, think of themselves as on a religious crusade in this period. How could they justify that? And he basically says, and again, I'll read the text when we're doing the question and answer front. This is what God wanted them to do. They invoke the authority of their God, the Christian God, to do what we would think of as a horrific crime. Right? So just take one step back. 80 years before this Dominican says to the King of Spain, we can't be violent towards native peoples. Fast forward to publication of a book called The Spanish Colony. The English say, we're not going to be violent towards native peoples. Get into the early colonial period, and there's massive violence, right? What is going on here? That violence forms a major theme of the book that I'm coming out called Troubled Continent. And the other major themes that I talked about, and this can be quicker, had to do with enslavement, which I talked about earlier, which we can talk more about in the question and answer, and is primarily at first about sugar production, and eventually would be about tobacco, rice, and other commodities. This is an early 16th century depiction, rather anodyne, benign description of Jamaica, but where enslavement really takes off. And I'm guessing that a lot of you have heard of the 1619 Project. Is that a yes? You guys have heard of it? Some, not everyone. It was a really big deal 5 years ago, the 1619 Project. It was everywhere. And it basically, and we can talk about this in the question and answer because that's a real argument. It's how do we think about the American past and who are the actors we should be thinking about. The 1619 Project said we should recast American history and put Africans and enslaved peoples at the center of it, not at the margins where they've been forever. One of the things that we know from the documented record is enslavement in this world really took off in the West Indies before it did on the mainland. And so there's this transformation of the Caribbean islands from these ecological wonder places into these kind of factories to produce sugar. They produce great wealth. You can still see some of these plantations. They produce urbanization on Barbados. They produce, and I know I'm going through quickly, they produce ecological change on a really wide scale. They produce, which you can keep seeing, and I'm going to go to a detail of this, and I can make these slides available if anybody wants to see them afterwards. I'm happy to share this with you. And if you can see that carefully, it might not come through very much. On the top left, it says fallen land, right? That is, they're transforming the landscape in order to produce sugar. And eventually, they would produce sugar factories on the West Indies, which Europeans describe as basically scenes of organized production and murder at the same time. And then the whole horrors of the slave trade, which are slow in North America, by the middle of the 17th century comes to dominate it. And so I end by just pointing out these scenes of violence, right? That sometimes scenes of violence are European depictions of natives attacking them. Sometimes it's scenes of Europeans depicting attack on native peoples. And sometimes it's Europeans erasing in their representation the violence in that one of the sugar mills, even though we know that this is embedded with violence. So I started off this thing by talking about audience, actors, and argument. Right? So my audience for this is anyone who will read history high school level up, wants to read narrative history. My actors are the people I've been talking to you about today. And my argument is that many of us may think the United States was a great idea. Many of us still think the United States is an amazing place, best country. But whatever your views, but I will tell you this. I'm not the first historian to say this. 100 years before you get the Declaration of Independence, 100 years before, this place, North America, is a troubled and violent continent. And that has to be part of the story about the origins of the country that we inhabit today. Thank you. I left lots of time for discussion, so please.
I noticed that you're showing a lot of various images on your slides, and I'm guessing you include various images in your book. I was wondering, when you're doing research, how do you decide what images, like ink prints and illustrations, are significant to include and which aren't?
That's a wonderful question. So I never heard that. So the question is, how, when I'm doing research, do I decide which images to include? So this goes to the audience question, which I mentioned. So this book, so I'm an academic historian, and most of my books are published by presses for my friends who are here in the room, right? For other historians. This is a book which will quite literally be on the shelf of any high school that you went to, right? This is good because this whole series is a very well-known sort of thing. So I have to think, how do I capture an audience of people who are not experts, who don't know it? So sometimes what historians love doing when we're in the archives is we make a discovery. This is something new. I found something that people don't know, and it folks goes for images as well as text. So this book, which will have, I think I'm fighting with the press, 40 pictures in it, whatever. Some of the pictures will be from that Debray book that I showed because they're really important. That massacre that happened in the Anglo-Pequot War, that's going to be in the book without any question. Others, this detail about the ecological transformation of Barbados, this fallen land, this is going to be in there. This is not a well-known image. I sort of found this randomly. This is in a manuscript at the John Carter Brown Library in Providence. I found it online. I was just kind of hunting around looking for things. That's going to be there because one of my arguments is not only is this a very violent period, but it's also a period where we see the origins in the Americas of ecological transformation. And this image, which is less known, someone on the ground is creating it. So that clicks to me, put that image in when I'm talking about the physical transformation of Barbados from the early descriptions of this ecological paradise. Think Malibu, basically, it's paradise. To descriptions within 20 years, in which a European visitor says, I don't hear a single bird, right? So denuded of trees to produce sugar by enslaved people that the ecological diversity there is gone. That's one of my themes also, right? That how did North America come to look like the place that would eventually there would be a United States, and what are the attitudes towards that? So it's kind of, so with this one, it's kind of that balance, right? I want to, when it hits the text, right? But I want to have some new things, but I need some canonical images. Pocahontas is absolutely going to be in my book with a description of that. At the moment, I have Pocahontas with, in a series of images, 3 images. One, a native Carolina Algonquian woman who is painted by John White and then engraved by the Debray Workshop, so 1590. She and her presumptively daughter, we don't know exactly. That Pictish woman, the naked woman tattooed with her spears, and Pocahontas. And I'll be using those to make a point about the transformation in the way English people think about colonization, civilization, as they would use the word. So those images are known, but I'll use them to make that argument. Stuart.
As you think about audience, since we're living in such polarized times, I think I'm curious what publishers think about this as well. So an audience who might know already the premise of your argument, America was a violent place, and here's facts and a story that's going to confirm that completely. How do you reach out to people who don't want to read your book, who want to read the Patriots' history of America or something that's going to paint things with much nicer terms, kind of along the lines of the picture that you showed of the Puritans walking to church with guns? I don't know if people commented on that. But yeah, how do you kind of bridge that divide to try to engage in a certain amount of academic diplomacy to the reading public who might not want to hear some of these stories?
That is a really great question. Everyone understands the question, like, how do I reach to this broader audience in our polarized times? This is very much on my mind. So one thing I do, which I gave short shrift here, is I really take questions of religion very seriously. And I sort of try to take people at their word, that as sincere. And I hope to paint them accurately. So I emphasize in this talk today, condensing this book into this talk, I emphasize English relations with Native peoples, English relations with enslavement, English relations with transformation of landscape. But I have whole sections of the book which deal with people like Anne Hutchinson, right, who's in Massachusetts, who's kicked out of Massachusetts when she has a theological debate with them. Now, I think that theological debate has something to do with the fact that she's female, and there are people who don't think women should be preachers in Massachusetts at that moment. But I very much get into their language, right, read their text and try to understand from their perspective what's going on, including when where did I do with my glasses anyway? When I read Bradford, Bradford, this book is amazing for capturing exactly that kind of moment that is not necessarily critical, but we have to take him at his word. So Bradford, so the Pilgrims and Puritans, if you have not spent your life reading them, and you probably won't, but anyway, often compared what they did to the Bible. Right? And so Bradford describes the arrival of the English in this forest using scenes from the Old Testament to compare themselves to. I take that seriously. It's like, this is how he saw the world. Now, I see the world differently, the people he met see the world differently, but I still want to give him the respect. So I end my book, if the ending stays where it is, I'm going into editing, things change. I end my book with the arrival of William Penn in my hometown. I'm from Philadelphia, in 1681, 82, and a map that someone created right around then of forever since. But I end my book then because I've been hyper-aware that my book is the first volume of something called The Archival of the United States, because William Penn lands. Anyone from Philadelphia? Yeah? We'll talk. Good. Anyway, William Penn lands about 5 or 6 blocks, model blocks, from where the Declaration of Independence is signed. Okay? So I actually very much set up, oh, you'll have to read another 100 years before you get there, and I'm not writing that. But very much want to say, this does create the place where that revolution would take place and then the country would go on its own. But there is no doubt been a shift in the way that historians write for a wider public. I had an academic advisor who many people on the academic left thought of as an arch conservative. And they always thought he's just defending the status quo and whatever. His last major book about the 17th century is called The Barbarous Years, and it's about the violence embedded in colonization. Right? It's just, we live in a generation now where we have to take people seriously and hope that they'll read the stories for what they are. You can come to different conclusions than I've come to. I am making an argument, but I do not want to lose those readers. Right? I want people to at least read. They may not like it. The thing about the series is this book, the series gets a lot of attention. Doesn't mean it's all positive. We'll have to see what happens, and maybe I'll be pilloried. We'll see. Please. Oh, I don't know who was first.
So what kind of prompted and inspired you, whether in your career and in your life as a historian, to really write about such a violent focus in American history that's not very well known?
That's a really great question. So I'm an academic historian, and as Nicole mentioned, my early work really focused on relations between Native peoples and European colonists in Eastern North America. And then it shifted earlier, and I wrote a book about a promoter of English colonization to answer a question, which I think is a really good question, which is, if Columbus is telling all Europeans how great the New World is in 1993, why don't the English go there sooner, right? And it's because they're just not organized. So I wrote a book about a guy who tries to make that happen, Richard Hacklett. That got me into this time period where it seemed like there were a lot of possibilities. I was there, right? I wrote a book about Henry Hudson, the explorer, and other sorts of things. But I was approached by this press and said, here's the series. Would you write volume 1 of this? And I took it as a writing and research challenge. Wow, what story will I tell? Though I've had some success writing books, this one has taken me 15 years to figure it out, because I've written it and I've rewritten it and I've rewritten it, and I thought, am I too strident on some political things here? Am I not there? And the world changed over the course of that. So when I pitched the book, it's obvious, I would guess it's obvious to you that enslavement should be a major theme here. But 15 years ago, that was less obvious to people looking at the early American period. It was going to be much more about Europeans and Native peoples with enslavement there. But now enslavement is a major theme in my book because the world has changed. And so I've adapted to it. We'll see what readers think. But it was also a challenge, and I like the idea of a challenge. And telling a story. Narrative history is really, to me, hard to write and fun to write. There was a question here.
Hi. I first want to say thank you so much for coming out here today and talking to us. It's really interesting to hear about your insights. My name is Bella. I'm studying public relations and history here at Pepperdine. So I'm a senior. I'm really interested in how we get information to different kinds of audiences. And so I was wondering, with because like the research that you do, I feel is like very important, and especially with like how we talk about the history of the Americas and specifically like American history. How do you think that like what do you think the process looks like of changing the way that students learn about American history, and like do you think that's a thing that's like possible to like change that narrative?
That's a great question. Wonderful question. So the question is, how do I think I'm entering this process? So basically most kids who go to schools in the United States, I'll use California as an example, right, are going to have quote unquote American history in fourth or fifth grade, eighth or ninth grade, or seventh, and then 11th grade, right? And if you're in California, something that's like fourth grade California history, which changed a lot in the way that that's taught. So there are teachers in the classroom teaching those subjects, right? And those teachers were not necessarily history majors, right? They might have been education majors. They might have been whatever. They sort of went into a teaching career, so they loved doing it. Their primary way into it for a lot of them when they're preparing lesson plans are textbooks. And textbook authors tend to be university professors, college or university professors, who have been chosen to write their textbook because of their command of the literature at any given time. So what I do, and what your professors here do if you're not writing a textbook, is you're trying to get to that audience. Right? That the audience then is people who write textbooks, know the information that I convey will then get into textbooks, get to teachers, and eventually get to students. Now there's a whole level of textbooks, right? They go from the sort of A-push, the U.S. history, advanced placement stuff, right? Which is basically college level text, right? To when you get down to eighth grade or then into elementary school, texts which are much shorter, the narratives are simpler, a lot of the complexity has been taken out of it. So the trick, I hope, is that the core lessons that I argue in this book will make it into that process. Now, that's aspirational on my part, but that's how I think it will work. Now, this kind of book that I'm writing, I made a disparaging remark about people buying books in airports. This book will probably be in airports. So you never know. You have to be going on a really long flight to pick up an 800-page book. But, going to Australia, it's like, oh, I'll pick up an 800-page book. Yeah, we'll see what happens. Anyway, great question.
Sorry,
sorry.
one more, yeah. I was gonna ask, you mentioned the argument that like some of the marginalized groups, like the indigenous and enslaved people, should have been maybe a center in American history, and I agree that they should definitely be a part of the American history that we learn about. But what would be your argument that they should be like a center or like one of the main focuses that we learn about in American history?
Fantastic question. Fantastic question. I can answer part of this in a very straightforward way. I end my book in 1680. I end my book at an event called the Pueblo Revolt. I mentioned William Penn's arrival, but the Pueblo Revolt is when a group of Puebloan peoples kick the Spanish out of New Mexico. And they're gone for 10 years. I mean, it's super violent. And it's motivated by religion, among other things, right? Okay? At that moment in 1680, putting aside New Mexico, if you looked across North America, that's the area north of Mexico, so north of the Rio Grande, but including Canada, there aren't a lot of people living in Canada, native or European. At that time, end of my period called 1700, 90% of the people are native, right? So this idea of the Columbian Exchange, which I mentioned, gives people the false sense that native peoples disappear very quickly. That's not true. The real rate of reduction among native peoples happens after my time period. So one of my arguments is just looking at who are the majority population. The book should be about native peoples. Now, it can't be just about native peoples. You asked about enslaved peoples in the West Indies, which are part of my story. And then eventually around the Chesapeake, enslaved Africans become the majority of the population. They're the overwhelming majority on places like Barbados. Barbados had no humans on it when the English get there in the late 1620s. The native population had been wiped out. Okay? So I can't tell the story of Barbados, which is central to telling the story of economic development in the British Empire, without saying this has to be based on looking at the experience of enslaved peoples. So what I try to do, to the extent that the records allow and that my imagination allows, is to try to bring people onto the stage and then try to see how history unfolds. So that's part of my argument, which really gets back to Stuart's question. We live in this polarized time where people get these overly political statements. It's kind of a demographic statement as far as I'm concerned. You couldn't write the history of Los Angeles now, the county that we are in, without recognizing that more than 50% of people in the county speak Spanish as their primary language. You couldn't do it. It wouldn't make sense, right? So that's the same sort of logic. I look for where are most of the people, and I try to tell their stories. But the kicker, the documents that we have are mostly produced by Europeans. So you have to find a way, I have to find a way to read into those documents to find stories that maybe the authors didn't intend. Some of this is called reading an almost erased page, reading between the lines, reading against the grain. There are a lot of phrases for it. That's really important for all of us, no matter what we do, is to look at a document, not just for what it says, but why it exists. It's why I made that big deal about that book called The Spanish Colony. Same book, different meaning, right, with the translation. So that sort of thing. I went on, but that's what so tricky with the text. There are two right here.
So you talk a lot about using resources from like different countries and things along those lines. As students tackling primary sources from other countries with languages we don't understand, how do you navigate around that?
Well, so I mostly work in Western European. I'm married to a historian who's a medievalist, so whenever anything's in Latin, I go to her. I studied French early on, so I read French. I picked up Spanish in graduate school, and I picked up Italian after graduate school. I showed that picture of Mays. That's a guy named Ramusio. I wanted to read Ramusio. Ramusio's never been translated in the entirety. I wanted to read Ramusio in the original, so I went to Italian class as a professor for 2 years. My spoken Italian is horrible, but I can make my way through a text. My spoken Spanish is horrible. I can make my way through a text. But we were talking before, one of the regrets that I have is in the course of my professional life, I never studied a Native American language. And in retrospect, I would absolutely have done so. And there are some which are actually taught for scholars. So you can go to Massachusetts and learn Wampanoag, used to be referred to as Massachusetts. You can go to Oklahoma and learn Cherokee. There are places where you can do it. I never did it. In part because the documents that I work on are not in native languages. And we could have a long discussion about oral history, because I'm a big believer in oral history. But for various reasons, I use transcribed oral histories as opposed to speaking with people. It's a whole big debate in the field about this. So basically, I think it's always good to learn another language. I spent a month teaching at the Sorbonne, and it was great. I had this international cast of characters. Thank God I could give my lectures in English, but the questions were in French. So I'm like, okay, I got to get a little better at this. So study languages. And Pepperdine's very international, I understand, so you have lots of reason to do it. Please.
First off, it's an honor and privilege to speak with you here today. My name is Rock. I was kind of curious as to what you spoke about earlier in regards to Columbus, and like you said earlier, there's kind of a split belief about what in sort of an ethical standpoint of his decisions to come here, and I was kind of curious what kind of your stance or your observations are about that, as I know some people believe that his actions were good, some people believe his actions were bad. There's a wide range of variety in regards to that, if it was a necessary evil. I was just kind of curious as to your thoughts on that.
Okay, so that's a great question. I should say my thoughts are on the record because I've written for public audiences things about Columbus. I think Columbus is a complicated character. I think we have to understand him on his own terms. And fortunately, there was a project, especially based at UCLA in the 1970s, to find everything about Columbus and to make it available. So his writings are available. So if you look at history, the writing of history over time, Columbus was super popular in the 19th century, into the 20th century. and it becomes adopted in the culture by Italian Americans, who say there would be no America without him, and he was Italian. There's a lot about him we don't know about, but anyway. Right? So there is an ethnic tradition. And I come from a city that has a lot of Italian Americans, and Columbus Day was a big deal when I was growing up. Columbus Day doesn't exist in California anymore. That's Indigenous Peoples Day now, right? So Columbus, up to 1992, had a pretty good ride, right? Literally, people had a pretty good interpretation of him. 1992 marked the 500th anniversary of Columbus, and a whole bunch of work came out on Columbus. And as one memorable scholar put it, point, Columbus was mugged on the way to his own party. The Columbus that emerges after 1992 is a despoiler of the environment, an enslaver of native peoples, this might seem like a capitalist. Is kind of a weird word to use for the 15th century, right? But basically someone who was selfish and mean and terrible and did these terrible things. And he's, to a whole generation of people, known as someone who launched, not accurate, launched enslavement in the Americas and launched the destruction of the environment. Those are overblown arguments. But he did both those things. They do despoil environments, and they do enslave native peoples. The native population of Hispaniola, where he first goes, estimated at 400,000 or so. Some people think up to 1 million. Say 400,000 people. When he gets there in 1492, by 1517 generation, numbered in the hundreds, from 400,000. And it happened before there was a known epidemic of an old world disease. So you say to yourself, how did that happen? And this is what scholars have looked at, archaeologists and all sorts of people talking to him. And they say basically it was his treatment of the native peoples. So if you come at it with that, it's hard to paint him, as he'd been painted before 1992, as a great culture hero. But there are people on both sides of this. And I know this because I've done these public lectures, and I get both sides of it. So it's complicated. But in my lifetime as a historian, he's really gone down in terms of reputation. But he's important, in a way that terrible people in history, so I'm not saying he's such, well, he's kind of bad, are important. We have to understand.
Hello, my name is Dixie Lovett. I am a history major getting my teaching credential, so I was really interested in Bella's question about how to incorporate this kind of history in a classroom. I'm planning on being a history teacher, high school, middle school. How would you recommend finding sources and things to teach for middle schoolers and high schoolers with this specific thing in mind? Because for me, it's really important to teach the stories that aren't taught about as much. That's why I want to become a history teacher. And so, yeah, I'm wondering what you recommend for incorporating this in a classroom.
Okay, that's a really great question. That's a question which is actually on my mind because in a few weeks I'm going to speak to a high school in New York, where I've spoken in the past. And so my approach, I don't think this is too racy. I think I can say this. My approach is to use these images as a way to introduce students to how do you read a picture? So both how do you read it to understand what's going on at a time period, but also the larger thing, because most students aren't going to become historians or teachers, how do you read pictures? How do we think more critically about pictures? So where I've run into kind of funny moments is when I talk to a 7th or 8th grade class, and I'm showing these pictures from DeBry. I think I have one here, or even somewhere, right? She's naked, right? And so, is that an issue? And this is a complicated thing. This is an image which is 400 years old. But so these sensibilities, I teach at a college level. I don't have to worry about showing this. I didn't hesitate to show this to you. But if you were 12, do I have this image? I don't know the answer to that. So I talk to the teachers. What's appropriate for this? The texts I work on are not appropriate for teaching middle school. When you get to high school, right, this book is perfectly intelligible. And it's excerpts of it. You can, things like this are great. I think it is important for high school, so it's 11th grade, 12th grade, to dip into existing primary sources. And we have some. We have letters from indentured servants, which tell about how terrible their life is. We have stories of wars. We have stories of, we have the whole Pocahontas story, which is an interesting, complex story on its own. I said at the beginning of this talk that I talk about historical actors. What my main thing is, I try to take it from the level of abstraction to the level of the person and get them to sort of think, not what they do in those circumstances, that's really hard, but to think, here's a story of someone. And I try to make that about real people who I know something about. There's so much we don't know about people in the period, but it's a great question, but that's how I try to do it.
Hello, I'm Evan. My question was more on how do you approach your bias as your own personal bias, as you're building your arguments, as you're reading deeply into these documents? How do you sit and be aware of your own biases as you're moving on in your writing and trying to tell these stories accurately?
That is an amazing and challenging question, but one which I think all of us who write about the past have to do. So I'm marginally older than you are at this point of my life. So I've had a lot of time to think about this, to think about bias, not just my bias, like how do I read something based on how I think of my own identity, but also based on how do I approach a source based on how I've thought about these kinds of sources. So I referred a few minutes ago to oral history. Let's take oral history as an example. Okay? So oral history, there are peoples around the world who record their past without writing it down. Right? I had written a book, Nicole mentioned in the introduction, I wrote this book called Deadly Medicine, Indians and Alcohol in Early America, 1995. I was invited to go to New Zealand by the government of New Zealand to work with Maori communities, to work with two Maori physicians. They wanted to know about the historical origins of Maori alcohol use and abuse because it paralleled Native North America. In both cases, neither of these populations, Native North Americans nor Maori, had alcohol before the arrival of Europeans. Now, I go to New Zealand, and Maori still mostly keep their history orally. So I go to meet these people in the government in Wellington, the capital city. I go to meet with them, and I meet with these members of the Maori community who say to me things that I'd never heard in my career. They said, "We're so happy to have you here." It was a whole ceremony. "We had you checked out. We had you checked." I'm like, what? They contacted the World Health Organization. What were people thinking about this book that I published 3 years ago about native alcohol use? Right? And they said to me, "We believe you will cause no harm. We know our history through oral history, but we don't know the documents. You're trained in the written documents. You need to go into the archives. But while you do that, you're going to travel this country." It's 2 islands. You're going to travel this country, and we're going to tell you our history. You may never tell anyone what you hear. It is not yours to tell. But we want you to know our perspective, our thoughts, when you go into the archives. And so I go into the archives, I find this stuff, I write this, it's my only clinical article, the Royal Australian Journal of Psychiatry or something. And I have my written documents, and I work with these two Maori physicians who sort of weave things in. It was an object lesson for me in how do I deal with culturally sensitive material. What are my biases? As someone trained in the canons of the Western Academy, I was trained to look at written sources. Oral history is something different. Oral history is unreliable. Oral information is unstable. People change the story on and on and on. Right? There's all this bias against oral sources. From my experience in New Zealand, I don't believe that. I believe that oral history is this very powerful body of knowledge which is not captured in written documents. But I also believe from my experience there that it's not for me to convey any of it. Right? So this becomes an ethical question as well as a professional question. Because I had plenty of information from talking to people that I could have used that would have been helpful. But that was a line I wouldn't cross, right? So it was an ethical kind of thing, and it put me back into this sort of thing. So it helped me think about my bias. I'm biased. We're all biased. Our reading of a document is biased whether we think it is or not, based on our own culture, our own education, our own whatever. Having that experience for me helped me, put that debate front of mind, right? So I wouldn't say I've climbed out of my bias. There'll be people in our polarized times who are going to read this book and who are obviously going to say, I am biased towards X, Y, or Z. To which my answer is, you have to make selections about the materials that you talk about in the story that you want to tell and the argument that you want to make. That does reflect my bias about what's important. Going back to the demography question, right? I have to tell the story of Native peoples at the center of the book because they're the dominant population of this place that I'm writing about, right? That's not the way people thought 50 years ago, right? 50 years ago, it was all about white people going over and Native peoples as their opponents or occasionally their allies, but usually not with any sense of agency, any sense that they shape what's going on. I have a different perspective. 20 years from now, someone's going to look back at my book and say, biased for X, Y, and Z that I don't see right now. We all have to wrestle with it.
I might come in with some final comments, if that's all right.
Please.
Well, I just appreciate the time that you all came and to spend here. I really want to give a round of applause for.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I think what you got to see today, those are teachers, those are in this field, this ways of how you create narrative and meaning. How do you look at sources? How do we do the work that we're here? Some of you are historians, some of you are communication. We all do this work of meaning and understanding. How do we tell that story? Whose story should we tell? And I thought this was a fantastic way to see how this is going to be shaping the national conversation, shaping that debate in this polarized world. How can we engage in that conversation? And to be thinking about the sources we use. I mean, the tour of images here that we got to see and think through, how do you draw meaning from this? How did you just stand back? Now, for our senior thesis students, do not pick 600 years in your project, Dr. Johnson. It is too big. You're going to do something small. But you could aspire to think about this, stepping back. What can we see in the archive? What is there? What stories are there left to tell? And I think you would agree there's a ton of stories left to tell. There's a lot of work to be done. And the way that we can shape this to tell those meaningful stories. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you about the summer research program we have, because this is a brilliant way to think about this. We are doing an inaugural program, the first pilot for having a summer archival experience, where you would get to go to the British archives for a month and work with primary sources to find out what's there. If you're interested in Jamaica, you're interested in the colonies, into Ghana, into India, there are resources in Britain from around the world because of colonialism and imperialism. So unfortunately, that is a space that we can go and gather and tell some stories. And so if you're interested in that, you want more information, I'm Dr. Gilhus. Come talk to me. I am happy to share that because we already have a group, but we need a few extra people to come with us. So if you would like to be part of that group, you want to be part of this and one day be a Peter Mancall, we can do that. So thank you very much for coming. I hope this has inspired you. Have a fantastic day.
Thank you.